Walter Brueggemann, Old Testament professor at Columbia Seminary in Decatur, a teacher of mine when I was at Emory, wrote recently, "The crisis in the U.S. church has almost nothing to do with being liberal or conservative. It has everything to do with giving up on the faith and the discipline of our Christian baptism and settling for a common generic U.S. identity that is part patriotism, part consumerism, part violence, and part affluence." The prophet Hosea could have said pretty much the same thing. The title of the sermon, Being Outwitted by God, comes from the writings of Brother Lawrence. Brother Lawrence entered a monastic order thinking that he was giving up on the happiness of this world to become a monk. He discovered instead a deeper happiness in a monastic life than he had ever imagined. He said, "God, you have outwitted me." That's a wonderful phrase and a testimony to what we call the providence of God. It comes from the same word as our word provide. We believe that there is a power greater than our own power and who is in control of the ultimate flow of history, even though we are not. So God provides and cares for us, often in ways that are surprising to us. That's why the theologians talk about the irony of history. The irony of history means that there will be surprises. Things are not always what they seem. We thought that we messed things up, but they came out better than we planned. We thought that we lost everything, but we discovered that we have found something that we could have never imagined. This prayer that I mentioned a few weeks ago illustrates this. It was allegedly found on a Confederate casualty in the Devil's Den, Gettysburg. "I asked for riches that I might be happy. I was given poverty that I might be wise. I asked for power that I might have the praise of men. I was given weakness that I might feel the need of God. I asked for all things that I might enjoy life. I was given life that I might enjoy all things. Almost despite myself, my unspoken prayers were answered." God, you have outwitted me. The providence of God and the irony of history. All this is based on the biblical understanding of the covenant. The Old Testament lesson for this morning is from Hosea, and it's a canny illustration of the covenant. It's one of those incomparable passages in Scripture, not only because of its literary beauty, which is breathtaking, but also because of its revelation of God, which is mind-boggling. It's from the prophet Hosea. The job of the prophet is to interpret history through the covenant that God has made with Israel, to see all things through the eyes of the covenant. And the way that that covenant was interpreted by most people before Hosea was that it was a contract. God is the one party to the contract, we are the other party. The party of the first part, that is God, is to provide certain services to us, namely life, abundance, and protection. And the second party, you and I, we're to respond with righteousness, obedience to the law, and goodness. If we don't, then the contract is off. All the pain and evil and suffering from which the covenant is protecting us, all that will come upon us. That's the way that the covenant was wrongly interpreted by so many people before Hosea. And I imagine even a whole lot of people today. It's a covenant of law, like a contract. So if you break it, you'll pay the consequences. But Hosea said that the covenant is not a covenant of law, it's a covenant of love. Before Hosea, the words that were associated with the covenant were law, righteousness, judgment, and punishment. After Hosea, the words that are associated with the covenant are faithfulness, patience, love, trustworthiness, and forgiveness. Once the analogy of our relationship to God was the covenant between a king and subjects. After Hosea, the analogy is the covenant between a husband and wife. Hosea was the first prophet to have the courage to say that. The covenant, he said, is as if God is married to Israel. He talks about that in the first and second chapters before our text for this morning. Israel is like a wife that runs away from a marriage. Under the law, her husband has a right to get rid of her. Most husbands would do that, and you wouldn't blame them. That's the image that Hosea has used in the first chapters, a faithless spouse. Evidently, he's reflecting on his own marriage to Gomer, who ran off and ended up in a life of prostitution. This is why we have Jenny and Forrest on the bulletin cover. Evidently, Hosea bought her back from a slave market. She had sunk so low. Hosea says that God is like that. Isaiah is like Gomer, who has run away, worshipped other gods, but God has brought her back. You would expect that God would give up on her because of her sins, but here's the revelation. God will not abandon Israel. Because of the covenant, God will always be faithful. God has given a promise, and God will be faithful. That's in the first two chapters of Hosea. He says that God is like a spouse who is faithful even though the partner in the marriage is unfaithful. In our text for this morning, in the 11th chapter, Hosea changes the metaphor from husband and wife to parent and child, a deeper, more profound covenant. He imagines God as the parent. This could be either a father or a mother. Either parent could be used in this kind of analogy because there are deep parental feelings. In the 11th chapter, God carries on a soliloquy, weighing what God should do with this child. Torn between the behavior of the child and the feelings that only a parent could have. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. Yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms. They did not know that I had healed them. That's a parent talking. How many parents here can remember what a rush it was to watch your child with your gentle encouragement to take his or her first steps? The pure joy of that moment. You remember that. Your child doesn't remember it at all, but you'll never forget it. I taught Ephraim to walk. That is a bond that is never broken. Or the night when your child is so sick, perhaps a frantic ride through the streets to the ER of the hospital. We did this with our son, Zach, when he was 10 months old and had meningitis. Holding the child close to you, trying to ease the child's suffering or fright. The child doesn't remember that, but you will never forget it. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? The name Ephraim is used in Hosea interchangeably with Israel, probably because for a period of time, Ephraim, that tribe, was the most prominent of the confederation of tribes, and so was representative of them. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not human, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come to destroy. You read Hosea and you see that God is determined to keep the divine promise because of the covenant. That's what it means. That's all a covenant is. It's a promise. It's as fragile as a promise. And God always keeps the promise. That is the epicenter of biblical faith. If you were to boil down the message of the Bible to one phrase, that would be it. God keeps the promise. If you want to define the essence of faith according to the Bible, it might be this: trusting that God will keep the promise. And if you want to know what makes life difficult as a person of faith, it's because it often looks like God is not keeping the promise. I was preaching somewhere a long while ago. I preached a sermon similar to this about God's love being like a parent loves her child. After the service, I was greeting people. A man went by. He had kind of a drive-by question. He said only one thing: "What about Auschwitz?" Then he walked on. Mercifully, he didn't hang around for an answer because I didn't have one. I've thought a lot about it since then, and I still don't have an answer. What about Auschwitz? A woman made an appointment to come and see me. She said, I have stopped believing. I'm not coming to church anymore because God did not answer my prayers. She prayed for things that are legitimate, things that you and I pray for. They weren't selfish or trivial at all. She said my prayers were not answered. I couldn't answer her either. Of course, she didn't ask me a question. She didn't wait for a reply. She came to make a statement to me. She wanted to file this with the preacher. God doesn't answer prayer. I'm glad that wasn't a question because I couldn't have answered it either. I don't have answers. All I know is that according to the Bible, faith is not about having answers. Faith is more about having the courage to go on without answers. Trusting the covenant, trusting that someday the absurd will make sense. Someday the scales are going to get balanced. Someday the innocent will be justified. That's the way that Paul saw it. In 1 Corinthians, he says, we see through a glass darkly. He means that it's a statement about human knowledge. We don't see clearly. That's our condition as human beings. What we do see is distorted. We see through a glass darkly, or another translation has it, we see in a mirror dimly. You get out of the shower, or you look in the mirror, that's the way that we see reality. We see only in part is another way that he puts it. It's as if we dwell in a house with just a few tiny windows. The only part of the world that we can see is through those openings. We see in part, but one of these days, he writes, we will see face to face. Now I know in part, and then will I understand fully. Then here comes the covenant, even as I have been fully understood. Listen to that again. Then I shall understand fully, even as now I am fully understood. So what I trust is not my knowledge. What I trust now is that I am known, that God knows me, loves me, speaks my name as promised. So maybe, just maybe, I can be patient. I wanted to talk about Hosea this morning because the last 2 weeks have been incredibly difficult, enraging, and confusing for ones in America. Chaos reigns. But we who follow Jesus should not give in to despair or lose hope. I have no clue what lies ahead for us as a nation, but let's be clear that God, our divine parent, will not give up on us. Tyler Durden in the movie Fight Club says, you have to consider the possibility that God does not like you. He never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you. This is the zeitgeist of our age. Many people believe this. But Hosea posits God as a different parent who loves us and doesn't give up on us. Talking of Auschwitz, lots of good books written about Auschwitz, but one of the best is by Eddie Hilsum, her book, An Interrupted Life. She didn't have answers either. In fact, I don't recall that she raised any questions in her book. It's instead a testimony to the presence of God in her life, a near mystical presence. It was always there from the beginning, but as her life moved towards the end and to Auschwitz, her description of her relationship becomes more intimate. The words she used, the words of a covenant. It was as if she didn't need to understand because she knew that God understood her. Letters that she wrote friends during her internment to the Westerbork transit camp poignantly describe the day-to-day horrors that the Jewish prisoners faced. Eddie's courage and determination remained strong, allowing her to rise above the hate around her and express her faith in God. As she wrote in her last letter, thrown from the train that took her to her death in Auschwitz, she wrote her friend, we left the camp singing. She didn't need to know why God let this happen because she knew that God did not want it to happen. It wasn't God's doing. God was on her side, so she sensed God's presence with her, beside her. Which is exactly the way that the early Christians talked about the cross. The cross didn't answer the question of human suffering. The cross is, after all, an instrument of torture. But they said, the cross is a sign that God has suffered with us. So the cross became for them a sign of a new covenant. God has suffered, so they knew that they were known. They knew that God had understood the kind of life that they had to live. This is why the cross is so central to the Christian faith. It's a sign of a covenant. Jesus said, where I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. And it happened. Where the church went, it held up the cross, and people came to hear about a God who doesn't give answers, but who gives the divine self to us. The cross is a covenant, and we Christians call it the new covenant. We should have called it the renewed covenant, because it's just like the covenant that God made with the Jews and revealed to Hosea. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? Even in the face of death, they trusted. God keeps the promise. How can I give you up? How can I hand you over to death? What is more inevitable than death? We're all going to face it. But because of the covenant, because of the cross, we can expect a surprise. When the philosopher A.J. Ayer died in 1989, there was a lengthy obituary in the Atlanta paper about him. I read it with some interest because I'd studied philosophy at Baylor and I'd read A.J. Ayer. I read a lot of philosophy in college to become wise. I ended up becoming mostly more confused. And A.J. Ayer had something to do with this. He and his tribe were members of a school called logical positivism, which set out to dismantle most of traditional philosophy. Ayer was an atheist who believed that there was nothing beyond the physical. If you can't see it, if you can't put it in your mouth, then it's not real. In fact, he was so persuasive and powerful in his argument that it said when Somerset Maugham was dying, he called A.J. Ayer to his bedside, like a priest, to reassure him that there was no life after death. A year before Ayer died, he suffered a heart attack and his heart stopped for 4 minutes. Then the doctors brought him back. Ayer wrote about that experience. He said he saw a red light and had become aware that the light was responsible, quote, for the governance of the universe. We now know that as a near-death experience, and it's quite common. It's when we think the spirit packs up, thinks it's going to another life. Then the doctors brings the patient's heart back again and the spirit comes back to the body. After such an experience, the testimony is almost universal. I could see things clearly. I could see what I can't see now. I could understand what I can't understand now. It's almost like having everything fall into place at last makes sense. Now I know in part, and then shall I understand fully. A.J. Ayer, the well-written atheist, had one of those experiences. Do you know what he said about it? He said the experience had left his atheism intact, but it slightly weakened. He said, quote, "It weakened my conviction that my genuine death will not be the end of me, although I continue to hope that it will be." In 2001, Dr. Jeremy George, the attendant physician, claimed that Ayer had confided to him, "I saw a divine being. I'm afraid I'm going to have to revise all my books and opinions." Do you know what he should have said? I mean, if he had any sense of humor at all, if he had any sense of irony, the kind that accompanies faith, when he saw the red light, he should have said, "God, you have outwitted me."